Hello, everybody. So we're going to get on to the final part of Robert Michels today, of Political Parties, the seminal work for which he is best known. I don't know if there's really any other works for which he's known, but we're finally at the end. I started this during the Texas ice storms, which simultaneously feels like forever ago and also not too long ago at all. It's only been a couple weeks. More video parts than I had intended to do, but it's such a dense book. And, I don't know. It makes me wonder if I'll ever do anything like this again. I might do something, maybe if the channel gets bigger, or maybe if I get something of a following, I'll do something like big. But, or another like big work that we'll go through. But, maybe you find this helpful, and so it's worth it. I'll definitely probably talk about books here in the future. It'll probably be a little more drive-by, a little bit more just talking about, just maybe like one video, one book, and do a shorter one, not do these like hour-long book club-esque discussions. But again, as I said, part of this is just me trying to figure out my thoughts on this, because Michels is so... it's just such a dense, thick, tedious work, but it's so important. And the last part is called Synthesis, the Oligarchical Tendencies of Organization. And so we're returning to what we basically talked about at the very beginning. This is an issue that comes with any kind of organization, whether it be party organization, as part of a political project. It can happen as well just as easily in the world of business. It could happen just as easily within any sort of institution or group or clique that needs to get organized. And so chapter 1 is called The Conservative Basis of Organization. What does conservative mean in this context? What Michels is talking about is conservative in terms of reactionary, opposed to revolutionary forces, invested in the current system, invested in the status quo, and wanting to preserve that in some fashion. But furthermore, he's speaking of conservative in terms of the old way of speaking about the left wing and the right wing being the monarchists who stood on the side of restoring the ancient regime and the aristocracy. And so he's speaking of conservative in a very fundamental international sense of the definition, that organization tends to promote a bias towards the status quo. It tends to promote a oligarchical formations or oligarchical structures of power that are hierarchical and have more privileges and power to those at the top, and it's minoritarian rule, typically. And so what he's saying is this is the very basis of organization itself, and we've seen all the reasons for that as we've gone through the book. But he gives his summarizing arguments. And so for this reason, because this is a short section and because we've already talked about a lot of the factors, I don't know how much commentary I'll have. I just feel I needed to finish the book at this point. Mostly I'll probably just be reading from Michels. I'm sure I'll have more commentary than I'm thinking I will, because I always have fucking a million things to say. But I'll just read our first excerpt from page 333. Quote, "Within certain narrow limits, the Democratic Party, even when subjected to oligarchical control, can doubtless act upon the state in the democratic sense. The old political caste of society, and above all the state itself, are forced to undertake the reevaluation of a considerable number of values, a reevaluation both ideal and practical. The importance attributed to the masses increases even when the leaders are demagogues." And so the first thing that he is addressing here would be perhaps the question that has been burning in the minds of some of you throughout this whole thing, which is there any hope or any utility or usefulness to democracy at all? Or rather, what is Michels saying about that? Is he saying there's no use for democracy? That there's like no change? And I think indeed this shows, in these final chapters, highlight Michels' thoughts that there truly is a difference between a pure aristocracy and a like democratic aristocracy, insofar as, what does he say here? The legislature and the executive becomes accustomed to yield not only to claims proceeding from above, but also to those proceeding from below. And as he says before, this isn't just the demagogues. It's not just agitators riling up people. These are actual legitimate claims coming from below that the state now may yield to. Like some influence of the masses upon the workings of the state is possible in the democratic form. However oligarchical it may be, it's at least possible with the democratic form. And that opens up this avenue of a self-corrective mechanism. Not just, we might think of in the terms of a constitutional monarchy. So the development of monarchy from simply an autocratic structure of power to there being some sort of parliament or something and a monarch with powers above that might make demands or have veto power or something of that nature. But you might also have voices from below now, from the masses, from the people. And so if you have democratic aims, that's pretty good. And so he's saying this is not for nothing. But as he says at the beginning of the chapter, the point of the chapter is to ask and answer the question whether or not it's possible for a democratic party to practice a democratic policy. And so while he admits there is some substantive change in the way things are done from a more pure oligarchy to a democratic one, we haven't answered that central question of whether such a party can pursue a truly democratic policy, a truly egalitarian or socialist policy. We've simply admitted maybe this democratic form allows for some feedback mechanism from the masses, but can the party structures, can the structures of power themselves be aimed at democratic ends as a matter of policy? We'll just go through, because a lot of this actually at the beginning is touting the benefits of democracy. Michels saying an incalculable progress in respect of public rights has occurred. He says, society will thus conform better with the principles of social justice. All to the good. But he says further down, still on page 333, this evolution will, however, be arrested from the moment when the governing classes succeed in attracting within the governmental orbit their enemies of the extreme left, in order to convert them into collaborators. Political organization leads to power, but power is always conservative. And that's the stark reality of, this whole series, in a way, if you want to apply it to American politics, at this moment, right now, this particular moment, what we're talking about is the failure of the Justice Democrats and why that is. Why the current political party structure, it's funny because he says the Democratic Party and it's capitalized, and it's like he's talking about the literal U.S. Democratic Party. Power is always conservative. It's an amazing line, by the way. Political organization leads to power, but power is always conservative. And that's the real problem that we've been talking about. That's the problem with anarchy, with eschewing the means of power, is that you can't do anything without power. And yet power itself, that is the conundrum, that it is of an inherently conservative nature. What does that mean? It means when you hold power, you become the status quo. If you hold it to any significant degree, your interests become interests of preservation and not revolution, as soon as you hold any modicum of power. And so when there is, as he says, a governing class that holds power, they successfully halt the movement of socialism, revolutions, progressivism, whatever it may be, by attracting the left-wing elements into their ranks and then making them collaborators. And that's what the Justice Democrats are. They're collaborators. They are collaborators with conservative structures of power. And of course they're conservative because power is always conservative. And so, the purely socialist or egalitarian movement attempting to achieve that, at least through electoralism, I won't personally say not possible at all. Maybe it is. Maybe it is by some means that we don't know of yet. But through electoralism, at least, through taking the most energetic, charged, left-wing, progressive elements, hungry for change, and channeling them into a structure that will rigidify them and make them dependent upon it, and slowly diverge their interests into its orbit. That will shunt off that energy into, it'll cool, it'll harden. It's like a lava flow being channeled off to just cool and harden. And that revolutionary energy never breaks out, and you never get the socialist revolution. And that's what the political party, that's the end that it serves within a capitalist system. The democratic elements of a capitalist system are specifically there so that the socialist revolutions and any sort of real, well, there might be some feedback mechanisms from the people to make sure that the masters don't push things too far. The people who've bought the government. We're talking here about giant tech companies. We're talking about the banks, investors, hedge funds, finance capital of every kind, international finance capital, the global plutocrats and the elites. These people who have bought the United States government and the special interests that fund all the major political parties. Everyone knows this. It's not even controversial to say it. The people whose interests are really represented in Washington, they have to allow for some democratic mechanisms, or they will create revolution, right? But the side effect of that is that, or the correlate, or the I don't know what you would say, the inverse thing to understand about that same principle is that democratic action is the very thing preventing the revolution. That's the role of the political party. And Michels, on the next page, he talks about, I won't directly quote him, but he talks about how many socialists see the political party as simply a means to an end. They see it as the proletarians needing to organize, and we have to cede a few of our principles to the conservative demands of holding power and using it. But ultimately, they recognize, this is not true socialism. A socialist party is not true socialism. Any sort of electoral strategy, they think they're going to get there incrementally, which is as Marx described. Maybe you have your revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. There's this whole progression of how you can supposedly progress to communism that has to be done in steps, and you can't just rush there. What Michels is pointing out, many people, it's this sort of conception of how change will occur that leads many socialists to accept some of the corruptions and the perversions of socialism that happen in the party structure. But his point is, this is all a mistake, because you're not leading to anything. It's not an incremental step in the right direction, because your party is not going to get more socialist and more egalitarian over time. It's going to get more conservative over time. There's a great line here. As the organization increases in size, the struggle for great principles becomes impossible. That says it all right there. As it increases in size and in complexity, the principles that you fought for have to go by the wayside. For all the reasons we've talked about, I'm not going to cover them again. You can watch the past videos in this series. I'm going to put it all into a playlist at the end of this video, and then you'll know all the reasons why the organization is not going to be a means to an end. It's not going to be an incremental change. It's not going to get more socialist over time. It's going to get less. It's going to get more capitalist. It's going to get more hierarchical, aristocratic, oligarchical, minoritarian. Might makes right. Conservative. Power is always conservative. And as you accrue more of it, you get more conservative. That's the secret. That's the paradox of reality. That's why you're not going to solve this through electoralism. So, talks throughout this chapter. We'll go to page 336. Quote, the logical consequence of these considerations is in direct conflict with the hopes entertained by the founders of the party. Instead of gaining revolutionary energy as the force and solidity of its structure has increased, the precise opposite has occurred. There has resulted, pari passu with its growth, a continued increase in the prudence, the timidity even, which inspires its policy. We're speaking again almost eerily about the Democratic Party, which that's the main criticism of the Democratic Party from the left these days. They're timid. They don't do anything. They act like they can't use the levers of power. The Senate parliamentarian just told them what can and can't be in the budget. The Republicans fired their parliamentarian multiple times, I believe, or at least overrode them multiple times. It's not a real position. These Senate rules, just to educate you briefly, a lot of these, when they just talk about, well, the Senate rules or the Senate norms, these are things that senators just made up by simple agreement. They're not the law. They're not the Constitution. Senators, a current Senate could ignore what a past Senate established as their norms very easily. And so all it takes is the will to do that. And they don't have the will to do that. The Democrats always act like, even when they control all of the branches of government, so they do now, except the judiciary, there's just nothing we can do. When the Republicans it never seems to be a problem for them. And that's because the Republicans' program is outwardly in line with the goals of the capitalists, whereas the Democrats is outwardly opposed to it, at least in some rhetoric they employ. And so they're compelled to be ineffectual. He talks about, I believe he's talking about the German Socialist Party here, where he says, as soon as it attained to political maturity, the party did not hesitate to modify its original profession of faith and to affirm itself revolutionary only, quote, in the best sense of the word. That is to say, no longer on lines which interest the police, but only in theory and on paper. And that's where we're at now. All of our revolutionary talk in America is in theory and on paper, or on the internet. It's people posting. There's no revolutionary action going on. I mean, you could talk about there were protests and riots and civil unrest. That's a tantrum. Didn't lead to anything. It was unorganized, so it had no power. It was an unorganized outbreak of violence. Same thing with the Capitol storming, by the way. I mean, yeah, Trump egged them on. Yeah, there were people planning stuff. But it was a bunch of these little different right-wing groups. They don't agree on the same things. Some people are going in there because they think the election is stolen. Others are full-on Q people who think these are all satanic pedophiles who need to be hanged. So the level of organization and coordination that the Democrats like to claim was involved there is pretty absurd. Especially because once they broke into the Capitol, they didn't know what to do. They were just wandering around aimlessly, streaming themselves and farting in Pelosi's desk and stealing things and taking selfies. It's like it was a tantrum and it needed to burn itself out. And so, yeah, and he is talking about the German Socialist Party. On 337, he continues, this same party, which at one time did not hesitate when the triumphant guns of the bourgeois governors of Paris were still smoking, to proclaim with enthusiasm its solidarity with the communards, now announces to the whole world that it repudiates anti-militarist propaganda in any form which may bring its adherents into conflict with the penal code, and that it will not assume any responsibility for the consequences that may result from such a conflict. A sense of responsibility is suddenly becoming active in the Socialist Party. Consequently, it reacts with all the authority at its disposal against the revolutionary currents which exist within its own organization, and which it has hitherto regarded with an indulgent eye. In the name of the grave responsibilities attaching to its position, it now disavows anti-militarism, repudiates the general strike, and denies all the logical audacities of its past. And there you have it. That's exactly what happened to the German Socialist Party. They fell right in line with the Kaiser. And, I mean, at the end there, disavows anti-militarism, repudiates the general strike. We've been talking about how the party leaders gained increasing control over the right to strike as these parties gained in power and size and complexity. Same thing happened in the trade unions. Same thing is true in unions in America. You're still more protected in America if you're in a union, but a lot of the unions that exist today that have been around for a long time are very corrupt and are there for the enrichment of the union bosses in many cases, because the same corrupting influence of power has done its work on them over many decades. Thus, from a means, organization becomes an end. That's on page 338. And that's exactly right. That The creation of a structure of power and the preservation of that power began as a means for achieving socialism. But socialism is revolutionary and aimed at the destruction of all systems of power. So, people who are benefiting from the status quo, the labor aristocrats, the party bourgeois, the labor leaders, even of proletarian origin, who have come to identify with their role as leaders and have come to depend financially upon the party. All these people who make up the party begin to see that organization as an end. It's this thing that preserves their lifestyle, their way of life, their current comforts, the status quo. And he has on page 339 a lament from Naumann, who writes, he says sarcastically, quote, the war cry, proletarians of all countries unite, has had its due effect. The forces of the organized proletariat have gained a strength which no one believed possible when that war cry was first sounded. There's money in the treasuries. Is the signal for the final assault never to be given? Is the work of preliminary organization to go on forever? And he says further down on the page, this is Michels writing now, all this has deviated far from the ideals of Karl Marx, who, were he alive, ought to be the first to revolt against such a degeneration of Marxism. It's very funny that Marx is often absolved by modern communists for the crimes of communist regimes that were later to occur. Right here we have it before those crimes even occurred, which I think actually gives more credence to that there were people, even before the Soviet Union arose, saying, even the socialism that's being practiced now is not what Marx would have wanted. It's not what he advocated for. And it's probably because of the corruption of the party structure, which was the very thing that did end the Soviet Union's revolution and the Chinese Revolution. The creation of simply new oligarchies in the form of their politburos. The struggle carried on by the socialists against the parties of the dominant classes is no longer one of principle, but simply one of competition. The Revolutionary Party has become a rival of the bourgeois parties for the conquest of power. It's exactly the relationship that occurs. They become another, just as all the bourgeois are in constant competition with each other, the bourgeois of other countries, with the upper classes. They try to enlist the proletarians in their struggle. This creates socialist parties that become powerful, organized, money in the treasury. But what are they then but yet another player in the game against the world bourgeois? Ooh, damn good coffee. It's my Twin Peaks reference for the day. So, on 341 here, this is the end of the chapter. He says, the term party presupposes that among the individual components of the party, there should exist a harmonious direction of wills towards identical objective and practical aims. Where this is lacking, the party becomes a mere organization. And so that's interesting. He's saying, who says organization says oligarchy. The organization becomes an end rather than the means. And eventually it ceases to be a party, because when we think of a political party, the connotation there is of something driven by some sort of idea or ideology or passion or this vision for the world in the future, a program of policies, something to improve society. And what he's saying here, it's what ends up happening is that is all shucked away by all the things that we talked about, and organization is the only thing left. The bones, or not the scaffolding, but it's like the foundations, the real strength, the solidity of the organization, or of the party is organization, and the demands and the needs of power and the constant struggle for power flay off all of the idealism in the end. I really do think at the end of this chapter that the electoralist strategy, it's time to say it, the electoral strategy for achieving left-wing goals of any type, whether this full-blown communism, whether it's anarchism, which sounds silly on its face, but there are anarchists out there who support Joe Biden, like Vaush, one of the stupidest streamers that exists online. But I think that electoral strategy is utopianism. People talk about, oh, your idea of having a revolution, or your idea of having even a third party, which, again, a third party would be subject to all the same things that we're talking about. But in the same way that if there was a new union movement now, it's almost better that there's not as many unions, because we wouldn't be dealing with the old corrupt union bosses. We could create new ones, and they would still get corrupt over time, but at least for a while, there would be some energy there, some reforming, some strength, some raw strength that has not yet decayed and hardened into a mere organization. In that same way, maybe a new party is what we need. Smash up the old party system. Maybe that's all you can have, is a continual smashing of the old system. You mow the lawn. You mow the lawn of the old decaying structures of power. The grass always regrows. New structures of power always take hold. And then you have to smash those and get rid of those. And maybe there is, even though this is cyclical, maybe there can be a sort of progression. As he says, democratic aristocracies are probably definitely better than the ones by pure bloodline, but better than just nakedly oligarchical systems of all kinds, having some sort of feedback mechanism to answer the demands of the people. So we could consider that an improvement. Things are better. But how do you move beyond democratic oligarchy? It's not through democracy. In the meantime, all we can do is just try and shake things up and break the power of the existing party structure in some way, which is why I am saying, as a leftist, I'm committed to the destruction of the Democratic Party. My goal would be no card-carrying members of the Democratic Party. Any person I can convince to leave the Democratic Party, I will. Any person I can convince to never vote for a Democrat, I will. Any person I can convince to join a third party, start a third party, I will. Any person that I can turn off from the Justice Democrats and clapping at everything AOC does, like idiot circus seals, for tweets, while we've seen, throughout the CARES Act, which was a horrific redistribution of wealth upward, one of the worst we've ever seen in U.S. history, all voted by the Justice Democrats. You see them go out and tweet about how it's abhorrent that we don't have a minimum wage yet and no one's fighting for it, and then they don't fight for it when it comes up before Congress, which, there's all sorts of things that indict them, that show that they are all talk and no action, that they've been caught up in the same thing, that the current status quo affords them a degree of celebrity and status within the Democratic Party, and even a little bit of power. But it's a shunt. It's to shunt off the revolutionary energy into something dead. So I'm against it. I'm against the Justice Democrats. I'm not for the idea, some people like Noam Chomsky say, you should pursue every single avenue to get change. No, we don't need to do electoral change. I'll still vote for a ballot initiative. I'll still vote for the lesser of two. You can even vote for the lesser of two evils. Fine. If you honestly do the mental calculus on every single candidate you vote for, and you believe in voting for the lesser of two evils, fine. I would prefer that you don't. I'll try to convince you not to. But whatever. It's time to have no loyalty to the Democratic Party and to be turning our eyes to the future for something new, because they are old and dead and corrupt. They're cryptocrats. It's a lichtocracy. These are ancient, old, half-dead corpses shambling around Washington, serving the same special interests that made the millionaires all in office, who don't care about any of the current forces that are tearing apart American society and culture, and the cliff that we're headed to with the climate. They're completely oblivious to these factors. They live in a Washington bubble, and so they need to be removed from office. And so, if that happens through a People's Party, if that happens through the Democratic Party just collapsing in and of itself by enough people just not voting for them, that a new party is forced into existence. Who knows what it could be? Because I'm almost ready to just vote for Republicans. Seriously, I can't stand the Democratic Party that much, and I think they just need to lose, because that's the only way that things will change. They are the main bulwark of any change in this country. So I think they need to lose. I'm probably not going to end up voting for Republicans. It would have to be the right one. and probably like in a low, like I voted libertarian for sheriffs, for example, and things like that nature, because of a libertarian sheriff, cool with me, not gonna want to enforce like weapons charges or drug charges or make that their priority. Awesome. Or like you want, or like a libertarian judge even, fine. Now, they can get weird with Texas and castle doctrine stuff of people shooting people coming out of their property, but, I don't even know how often that happens. And those are all of the social unrest and crime and people defending themselves from crime and all that stuff. That's all, in my view, a function of poverty and social dissolution. And those need to be addressed from the top down. You can't just, doing stuff like the incredibly evil crime bill that the Democrats did in the 90s of let's have a huge spike in incarceration and just grind the boot into people's throats to deal with the crime problem. That was the wrong answer. Regardless of what you think about it morally, it's just the wrong answer. You're never going to solve like the problem of crack tearing apart communities by giving people harsher jail sentences and like having a death penalty for drug dealers and doing what Joe Biden does, where he's like, I want to kill drug dealers and bust up raves and find some justification to put the rave promoters in jail. The 90s were a very bizarre era. I guess I'm just retreading old leftist gripes with centrist Democrats. But I think it's all illustrative of how small-minded they are and how counterproductive to progress they are as a party. Let's do chapter 2 here. While the majority of socialist schools believe that in a future more or less remote, it will be possible to attain to a genuinely democratic order, and while the greater number of those who adhere to aristocratic political views consider that democracy, however dangerous to society, is at least realizable, we find in the scientific community a conservative tendency voiced by those who deny resolutely and once and for all that there is any such possibility. And he cites Gaetano Mosca here, who said that no highly developed social order is possible without a political class. That is to say, a politically dominant class, which is the class of a minority. Minoritarian rule is not democracy. And so the impossibility that Mosca brings up is very simple. He says you cannot have any sort of reigning political order without a political class. So this is what we were talking about going back to the first couple chapters. You need specialists. You need an institutional, organizational hierarchy. That creates a political class, a class of people who have political power, who rule over the majority who don't. So most people will not have that specialty, and they will not be as good at steering the ship of state as somebody who has spent years learning how to do so. But that's not democracy. It's minoritarian rule. So there's an inherent contradiction. In chapter 2, I forgot to say, it's called Democracy and the Iron Law of Oligarchy. He kind of goes through and talks about, he brings up Vilfredo Pareto, brings up Mosca, as we said. What do we have here? It's a theory that a directive social group is needed. It's for society. For society itself, you need some sort of social group that directs the rest of society. He brings up the example of the school of Saint Simon. And he says that while holding that the concept of class would someday cease to be characterized by any economic attribute, they did not look for a future without class distinctions. The Saint Simonians dreamed of the creation of a new hierarchy, which was to be founded not upon the privileges of birth, but upon acquired privileges. This class was to consist of, quote, the most vital, the most intelligent, and the strongest, the living personification of the threefold progress of society, end quote. Since vitality, intelligence, and strength. A bit abstract, but I think we know what he's saying. And, quote, capable of directing it in the widest course. At the head of their socialist state, the Saint Simonians desired to place those whom they termed hommes generaux, who would be able to prescribe for each individual his quantum of social labor, the individual's special aptitudes being taken into account in this connection. Here it is obvious that dependence must be placed upon the discretion of these supermen. And he says that one of the ardent followers of St. Simon, when pressed on the issue, somebody said, well, this would lead to despotism. And he said that, what is it? He did not hesitate to declare that the majority of human beings ought to obey the orders of the most capable. They should do this, he contended, not only for the love of God, but also on the grounds of personal egoism, and finally because man, even if he could live in isolation, would always need some external support. What does he say further down? The St. Simonian system is authoritarian and hierarchical through and through. The disciples of St. Simon were so little shocked by the Caesarism of Napoleon III that most of them joyfully accepted it, imagining that they would find in it principles of economic socialization. So we have Bonapartism rearing its head there again. And the curious ideology of the St. Simonians, which admits it's like we're moving beyond, okay, so democracy was political power, moving beyond rule by hereditary possession of power as a sort of property right. Democracy introducing some sort of feedback from the masses, allowing them to form their own hierarchies, and allowing hierarchies of merit and specialty and ability to compete with one another. Notice how democracy and capitalism, in that respect, basically the same. It's very similar. I mean, democracy and capitalism go just as easily hand in hand as monarchy and the feudalist system of economics. They almost imply each other in a sense. They almost require each other in a sense. And so what the St. Simonians imagine is we'll move beyond economic hierarchy. What's next? It almost sounds like a sort of like Nietzschean Marxism, where you have some sort of supermen determining, what's the old Marxist axiom? To each according to his, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Well, they'll determine what your abilities are and what your needs are. And obviously all the Americans and people who've been raised in the democratic tradition listening to this think that's horrifying. I would simply argue, in principle, that's not a bad idea. Like you want to be ruled in any, elitism is not bad in any area of human endeavor or activity where we really give a shit. You want an elite pilot flying your plane. You don't want to determine the pilot by democratic vote. You want an elite surgeon to operate on you, or your son, or your loved one, your wife, your husband, your daughter, your mom, your dad. You want a surgeon elected by popular vote, or do you want one that knows what he's doing? That's had some training and education and years of competency. Why wouldn't we want that in government? But the problem is, how do you create such a thing? How do you determine that the people in charge are actually supermen? Because those of us who are not supermen, how will we know what a superman looks like? How will those of us who are genetically, what is it Alan Watts said in his criticism of eugenics? He said, how will those of us who are genetically unregenerate make up our minds as to what genetically regenerate people might be? If we're going to, if we're going to determine what kind of leader is qualified to choose things for us, are we qualified to choose that leader? If we are, we should be qualified to govern ourselves. And so it's sort of this paradox of authority and ceding authority that the St. Simonian model runs into. But I suppose I would say I've just given an argument for and against elitism. But I think what they're grasping for, whatever you think of their ideas, most people will not agree with them, with a God-given hierarchy as a means of establishing socialism. Most people think that's a contradiction in terms. That's what I love about Michels, is he opens up these beautiful Pandora's box of paradoxical beliefs as we try to grapple with these apparent paradoxes of political ideology. But what's interesting is just that they're looking to the future, something beyond capitalism and beyond socialism, quite frankly, because socialism, I think, the more I examine it, is a capitalist fantasy, in a way. It's still a fantasy based on a lot of the presumptions of capitalism, and oftentimes when it has been practiced, whether or not you think it's that in theory, because Marx did come out of liberal society, he came out of democratic capitalist society. And so even though he's trying to imagine something beyond that, at least in practice, we can say they never moved beyond it. In a way, you could almost say Russia and China represented like a regression to, it's very odd to me that China, they're you can call them state capitalist, command economy, whatever you want. They're doing the same thing the Chinese have always done. They have an emperor. Xi Jinping is an emperor. There's nothing democratic about that system. They've gotten rid of, they're doing emperorship in the same way the Romans did by, the group of upper crust elite men determining which among their ranks by merit will get the job, not just by strict bloodline. Romans were doing that 2,000 years ago. Big whoop. They did not advance to communism. And Michels would argue that's because communism is not possible. At the very least, we could say they went from a largely pre-industrial society to jumping right into something that's supposed to come after industrial society. So at least that's a problem. I don't know. Anyway, so he goes on to say, Bakunin, this is page 346, Bakunin opposed any participation of the working class in elections. He was convinced that in a society where the people, the mass of wage earners, is under the economic dominion of a minority consisting of possessors, the freest of electoral systems could be nothing more than illusion. Democracy is even regarded as the worst of all bourgeois regimes. It can dare everything with impunity, being always ready to justify its despotic acts under the convenient pretext that they are done for the good of the republic and the general interest. I mean, there you have it. I mean, we have another thinker, Bakunin, basically advocating the same thing as Pareto and Mosca, even though he was politically very different from both of them. He would at the same time hold the view these democratic socialist organizations will never achieve socialism, and it's a sham for you to participate in them, and the choice you're being given is only the illusion of choice. Think of the primary system in America. You don't pick the candidates. To the extent that you do, the parties are private organizations. They can put their finger on the scale any way they want, and they have, and we know for a fact that they did in the case of stopping Bernie Sanders from getting the nomination. There was manipulation from the party leadership in both 2016 and 2020. Did they break the rules? No. I mean, was it fair? Was it a representation of the democratic will? No, because the rules don't say that they have to do that. So it's not a democratic system. You get to choose between your masters, and the choice is curtailed to those the masters find acceptable. And so that's why Bakunin said, you shouldn't even participate. Same thing I'm advocating here. Now, I don't like anarchism. I don't think that's the answer either, but I agree with Bakunin. You shouldn't participate. To the extent that you can afford to not participate, you shouldn't. And so far we've been talking about democracy may not always succeed, but it has its upsides. Here we have the downsides. It whitewashes all of the bad that the regime does, even though it comes from the same, it's just as despotic as a tyrant or a king decreeing things as when, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Supreme Court justices, when they make their decisions, just as despotic. The amount of actual accountability that the citizenry has over them is very little. The overall citizenry of the United States, very little. But they get to whitewash everything they do by saying, we're the democratically elected voice of the people, and what we do is an expression of the democratic will. And so that makes it to where, there was honesty when the king said that this is what the king decrees. The people have to obey the king. And the people could say, the king doesn't represent me. The king could say, off with his head, that didn't factor into it. There was no claim of that. The king has the divine right of rulership. Here we're getting the divine sanction has become the democratic stamp of the people's will that is being claimed, even though it's not legitimate, because that can't ever be expressed through party politics. The democratic will is never expressed through party politics, at least not totally. Maybe in pieces here and there that are allowed by the oligarchs. Another interesting part on page 348. Consequently, the critics in advance of the Marxist social order ask whether the instinct which today leads the members of the possessing classes to transmit to their children the wealth which they, the parents, have amassed, will not exist also in the administrators of public wealth of the socialist state, and whether these administrators will not utilize their immense influence in order to secure for their children the succession to the offices which they themselves hold, which is exactly what happened in communist China. And then we have in the Juche system of North Korea the apotheosis of that, the Kim family, as ruling by divine right. It returns the evil, tyrannical character of monarchies returns through a socialist revolution. Interesting. And it's predicted here. And he says, what does he say? Another Michels prediction. To put the matter less euphemistically, there will then exist a dictatorship in the hands of those leaders who have been sufficiently astute and sufficiently powerful to grasp the scepter of dominion in the name of socialism and to wrest it from the hand of expiring bourgeois society. Exactly what happened. So, Michels should have gotten, is there a Nobel Prize for sociology? If there is, there shouldn't be. But if there is one, Michels should have gotten one. I don't even know if they were doing that at this time. Who knows? What do we have here? There's little difference as far as practical results are concerned between individual dictatorship and the dictatorship of a group of oligarchs. Now it is manifest that the concept dictatorship is the direct antithesis of the concept democracy. And so, yet again, what does he say? The attempt to make dictatorship serve the ends of democracy is tantamount to endeavor to utilize war as the most efficient means for the defense of peace, or to employ alcohol in the struggle against alcoholism. Actually, the first example there, people use war to preserve peace all the time. So you can say that's hypocritical or self-defeating. Maybe it is, but in practical terms, it does happen. Using alcohol in the struggle against alcoholism makes a little more sense as that is truly contradictory. I don't think you can really do that. So I give him half and half in his examples, but moving on, he says it is extremely probable that a social group which had secured control of the instruments of collective power would do all that was possible to retain that control. Theophrastus noted long ago that the strongest desire of men who have attained to leadership in a popularly governed state is not so much the acquirement of personal wealth as the gradual establishment of their own sovereignty at the expense of popular sovereignty. Yeah, I mean, I have little to say about that, except that he's just sort of fleshing out the iron law of oligarchy further and extracting all the general principles that we've been talking about through this. What do we have here? This is a great example. He talks about, so let's give some context here. He says the defects of Marxism are patent directly we enter the practical domains of administration and public law, without speaking of errors in psychological field and even in more elementary spheres. So again, we're talking about the practical realities that cause oligarchical forces in party politics. It's not the conservative critique of Marxism doesn't work because of human psychology or human nature or something like that. It's about human social nature. But what does he say? He says that whenever socialist theory has endeavored to furnish guarantees for personal liberty, it has in the end either lapsed into the cloudland of individualist anarchism. Perfect. Cloudland, cloud cuckoo land. Anarchism is in cloudland. It's a fantasy. You can't ever achieve it. No logical way to achieve the program, as Michels says. But the part that's perfect, individualist anarchism. It is the ultimate form of individualism is anarchism. That's why it'll never work. Never achieve any power. But he says that, or else it has made proposals which could not fail to enslave the individual to the mass. Here is an example. To ensure that the literature of socialist society shall be elevated and moral, and to exclude a priori all licentious books, August Bebel proposed that the nomination of a committee of experts to decide what might and might not be printed. To obviate all danger of injustice and to secure freedom of thought and expression, Bebel added that every author must have the right of appeal to the collectivity. It is hardly necessary to point out the impracticability of this proposal, which is in effect that the books, however large, regarding which an appeal is made, must be printed by the million and distributed to the public, in order that the public may decide whether they are or are not fit for publication. So we don't have the same logistical concerns today, but it's exactly the same thing with freedom of speech online, right? If you say, we've determined that this document is so toxic and harmful that it can't be read by anybody, the people say, well, how do we know? We haven't read it. And they say, well, why don't you read it, and then we'll take a democratic vote on whether or not it should be read. That right there, you have to let in order to let the democratic mass weigh in on the issue, you have to cede your authority to them. In order for the democratic mass to trust the experts, they have to cede their authority to the experts. It's that paradox of authority again, though, that if you actually ask the masses what should be censored, you're basically admitting that no experts are like, it's the Christopher Hitchens axiom of who are you going to vest with the power to say what you can't read. And this is exposing the ridiculousness of that, so long as you claim that this is the real paradox, claiming that that's the democratic will, that you represent the democratic will to tell the mass, the people, the demos, what they can and can't read. Because only they can decide if it is truly democratic will. And then that question, then the only answer you can possibly give is, well, then they must be allowed to read everything and everyone must be his own judge. And so you can have the cloudland of individualist anarchy. Everyone's the judge, everyone does as he likes. Or you can have the oligarchical committee, who doesn't really represent the mass, decide to speak for the mass and say, no, we decide what you read. Something that cannot fail to enslave the individual to the mass. Further on page 351, he says, a party is neither a social unity nor an economic unity. It is based upon its program. Difference between a party and mere organization. In theory, this program may be the expression of the interests of a particular class. In practice, however, anyone may join a party, whether his interests coincide or not with the principles enunciated in the party program. The Socialist Party, for example, is the ideological representative of the proletariat. This, however, does not make it a class organism. From the social point of view, it is a mixture of classes, being composed of elements fulfilling diverse function in the economic process. But since the program has a class origin, an ostensible social unity is thereby conferred upon the party. So yet again, ethical embellishments of these political struggles and class struggles. As he points out, that's an ideological identification and sheen that we're putting over the party that isn't really there if you examine it in practical and sociological terms. So let's see here. We're going to kind of jump through a little bit more. So in chapter 1 of the section, he asks whether the problem is really incurable. And he says he's not going to answer that until later, but the answer is yes. The problem is incurable. In Michels' view, if we want to give an honest thesis or an honest representation of what Michels believes, he thinks the problem of actually having a democratic policy within a democratic political party is an unsolvable problem. And it really is the iron law of oligarchy. There's no fighting it. And what does he quote here? I think it's Fourier. No, it's Théophile Gautier. What is a revolution? People fire guns in a street. That breaks many windows. Scarcely anyone profits but the glaziers. The wind carries away the smoke. Those who stay on top push the others under. It is worth the suffering to turn up so many good paving stones which otherwise could not be moved. Or we may say, as the song runs in Madame Angot, it is not worth the bother to change the government. And so those metaphors, that's sort of the end of the chapter, but I'll skip back a little bit at page 354. He explains it in explicit abstract terms. The principle that one dominant class inevitably succeeds to another, and the law deduced from the principle that oligarchy is, as it were, a preordained form of the common life of great social aggregates, far from conflicting with or replacing the materialist conception of history, completes that conception and reinforces it. He says the majority is thus permanently incapable of self-government. Even when the discontent of the masses culminates in a successful attempt to deprive the bourgeoisie of power, this is, after all, so Mosca contends, affected only in appearance. Always and necessarily there springs from the masses a new organized minority, which raises itself to the rank of a governing class. Thus the social revolution would not reflect any real modification of the internal structure of the mass. The socialists might conquer, but not socialism, which would perish in the moment of its adherents' triumph. Chapter 3 talks about party life in wartime. I'll just give a summary of that. It's very short, basically talking about during World War I and what happened to the German Socialist Party. And what he says is that, obviously, the theory of communism is that class should be primary and not anything else, including nation. Nation would be included in anything else. For after all, the thesis is that the proletarian of every country has more in common with one another as the working class than they do with the bourgeois in their own society, because those people are their class enemies. Those are the people oppressing them. So if you have the proletarians in all these countries of the world, and they're all being oppressed by the bourgeois of all these countries in the world, the Marxist theory is we have a world revolution. Workers of the world unite. Everyone oppose the bourgeoisie of the international bourgeoisie. Excuse me. The thing that happened to the German Socialist Party in World War I is they put nation over class. They came to argue that, let's see if I can find any quote that neatly sum this up. They basically said that it was For Germany, a defeat must be avoided at all costs, for its results would be disastrous, while in the case of England and France, they could not fail to be salutary. That they made a self-serving argument that the socialist project could only be helped by Germany continuing to exist, and that the English and the French were just the way their societies and cultures were constituted at the time was too hostile to socialism, so Germany had to survive. And that in spite of the triumph of the German bourgeoisie and the German aristocrats at the head of the government, this would still lead to better things for socialism in the end. It's not really important to talk actually so much about the arguments that they made because they were self-serving arguments. So even though you can go into the internal reasoning of why the German Socialist Party became lapdogs to the Kaiserreich, the reality is that it doesn't matter. They were destined to do that because what that really represents, regardless of their rationalizations or their self-serving arguments, was nothing more than trying to preserve the status quo that they benefited from. The same thing that we've been talking about, the divergent interests of the party leaders and the masses. And so it got to the point to where they repudiated, not only did they strip from the party the right to strike and argue against the need for revolution, they then turned on the idea of a united universal class struggle and saw nation as of first importance, at least for the duration of the war. And that's the story right there. They came to betray all of the principles of socialism as the most, as Michels points out, the most productive and prestigious and respectable organization in the entire international. They turned on all of the principles of socialism. So we come to chapter 4, final considerations. This is it. This is the end. We're getting to the end, y'all. talks a little bit about the indispensability which leadership fills, that leadership is a necessary phenomenon in every form of social life. He says, consequently, it is not the task of science to inquire whether this phenomenon is good or evil, or predominantly one or the other. But there is great scientific value in the demonstration that every system of leadership is incompatible with the most essential postulates of democracy. We are now aware that the law of the historic necessity of oligarchy is primarily based upon a series of facts of experience. Like all other scientific laws, sociological laws are derived from empirical observation. And so he says on page 365, every party organization represents an oligarchical power grounded upon a democratic basis. The oligarchical structure of the building suffocates the basic democratic principle. That which is oppresses that which ought to be. For the masses, this essential difference between the reality and the ideal remains a mystery. But it's not a mystery now that we've read this. And that's a perfect way of putting it. The is suffocates what will be. That's what power does through attempts to preserve the status quo, and why it will always be anti-idealistic, anti-revolutionary, and therefore, by definition, anti-socialist and anti-left. The left being the force that wants to change society. What does he say? The modern proletariat, enduringly influenced by glib-tongued persons, intellectually superior to the mass, ends believing that by flocking to the poll and entrusting its social and economic cause to a delegate, its direct participation in power will be assured. That's the central illusion of electoralism, the utopianism of electoralism, the idea that the way to the glorious socialist future is through the ballot box. Which is, the reason why I call it utopian, it's the idea that you don't have to do anything. All you have to go in and say, this is what I want, and then it'll happen. And we should all know why that's not true from reading up to this point. But that's the thing about people who act like voting, just to go in one final rant, or one of my final rants of this whole series, people who act like voting, we're the realistic, serious people. It's like, you think that just by going and casting a ballot that you're going to change society, that you're going to, bring forth the fully automated luxury gay space communism where everything is shared, all social values are accepted, and we move past poverty and all that. You're going to get that just by voting for it. When all of the structures of power that are counting those votes, all the structures of power into which your delegates are going to become a part of, are all rotten and corrupt, and you think you can just say so and it'll change. It's Karenism. It's Karenist ideology. We didn't have a word for it, but idealism through democracy is ultimately Karenism. It's you thinking you can complain to the manager, you can say what you want to happen, you can make demands, and they will happen. When what has always changed history and what has always actually affected anything is conflict. It's not just saying so. And that's what a vote is. It's just you saying so. And it's an illusion and it's a lie that the current power structure purveys to you that you should vote. But so what Michels says, that for those of you as a sop to you Democrats out there, page 366, he says, the mass will never rule except in abstracto. But consequently, the question we have to discuss is not whether ideal democracy is realizable, but rather to what point and in what degree democracy is desirable, possible, and realizable at a given moment. That's why I say I don't rule out, if it comes to my state to legalize weed by direct ballot initiative, hell yeah, I'm voting for it. I'm not going to abstain out of some sort of weird principle. But I would simply recognize that democracy is realizable at that moment, because if that moment comes, it would mean that the powers that be have determined that it is within their Overton window of acceptability on the economic front, criminal justice front, whatever determinations they've made, to allow for the possibility of that happening. But they're never going to allow for the possibilities of things that, would undermine the whole structure of power that allows them to continue to entrench and preserve themselves. So they'll throw out a sop to the public every once in a while. And in that case, oftentimes it is something like a culture war issue or a like we're going to vote in Austin in May on whether to allow homeless camping. That is a very real, tangible effect on people's lives, but it's mostly a referendum on what do we want the culture of our city to be? Do we want it to go more in the California, San Francisco direction? Or do we want to crack down on homeless camping and go the more right-wing direction? It's ultimately those are the kinds of things that the leadership is going to let us vote on, because they have the least consequence to the actual structures of power, and that has some of the most investment from the masses, and you can feel like you've really changed something or done something. But it's all within the range of what they find acceptable for you to vote on and discuss. Nevertheless, it still may be very important for you, for your cultural issue to win out, right? So sure, vote for it. If that opportunity arises and you've been offered that little bit of power, sure, seize it. But what does he say here further down? The great error of socialists, an error committed in consequence of their lack of adequate psychological knowledge, is to be found in their combination of pessimism regarding the present with rosy optimism and immeasurable confidence regarding the future. Further down he says, within the limits of time for which human provision is possible, optimism will remain the exclusive privilege of utopian thinkers. And so he brings in the practical usefulness of democratic ideas and thinking and democratic practices, in particular, in moments within the system where it's realizable, and allows for the mild, not system breaking, but the system incorporating the will of the masses as a self-corrective and to make itself stronger. But it's what we're talking about here. What we're dismissing is the idea of bringing forth some sort of substantive change or utopian future through voting or through electoralism or through democracy. It's utopian, and it always will be. Saying too much a bias of pessimism against the present. So not feeling that within this current system you can do anything, and rosy optimism of the future. Not understanding and reckoning with the pitfalls that can occur from trying to bring your revolution forth, because you don't ever know what's going to happen when you try a revolution. Most likely it won't be a good outcome. Most likely you won't get what you want. Let's see here. What he sort of suggests on page 368 is a sort of another attempt to demonstrate the value of democracy, where it may exist, as he says, we have had to inquire if and in what degree democracy is an ideal which we can never hope to realize in practice. A further aim of this work was the demolition of some of the facile and superficial democratic illusions which trouble science and lead the masses astray. Finally, the author desired to throw light upon certain sociological tendencies which oppose the reign of democracy and to a greater extent oppose the reign of socialism. The writer does not wish to deny that every revolutionary working class movement and every movement sincerely inspired by the democratic spirit may have a certain value as contributing to the enfeeblement of oligarchic tendencies. As he said before, there are tangible improvements we made to the human condition, to the state of human rights and things of that nature. And I would just point out at this point, if you're a staunch Democrat and you've read this whole thing or you've watched along with me, it should be beneficial for you to destroy those superficial illusions, because they can only hurt your cause. So you should be, even if Michels is critical, again, as I said at the beginning, since socialism is something I'm sympathetic to, or at least we'll say redistributionist policies and leftism, collectivism. I'll probably do another video on this. I identify as a collectivist rather than a communist or a socialist or any existing ideology with all these centuries of baggage and theory and crap, because none of them have worked. And the important thing to me is to emphasize the collective and the collective's power and our collective social destiny, more so than talking about abolishing the means of production and all of these things that will be contentious and that we haven't really figured out how to realize. But he's simply saying maybe there's some benefit. Maybe that having that ideal you can strive for, is beneficial in and of itself. And he tells the story of an old farmer who what is it? After the old man's death, he tells his sons that he buried a treasure in the field, and after his death, his sons go out all digging in the field. He says they dig and they don't find it, but their indefatigable labor improves the soil and secures them for a comparative well-being. The treasure in the fable may well symbolize democracy. Democracy is a treasure which no one will ever discover by deliberate search. But in continuing our search and laboring indefatigably to discover the undiscoverable, we shall perform a work which will have fertile results in the democratic sense. We have seen indeed that within the bosom of the democratic working class party are born the very tendencies to counteract which that party came into existence. Thanks to the diversity and to the unequal worth of the elements of the party, these tendencies often give rise to manifestations which border on tyranny. And so, yeah, I maybe read a little too long beyond the parable of the farmer, but I think it's a good analogy. Of what democracy is, of this ideal that we can work for, that can have some practical use or application in the here and now. But that democracy even, because we talk often in the West of how socialism is an unrealizable dream, so is democracy. To the extent it can be realized, it's oligarchical democracy, which is functionally, as I've said earlier in this video, it's just the political correlate of the economic system of capitalism, which is why they go hand in hand. And it's not true democracy in the sense of liberating man or abolishing class or giving all men equal power or equal control of their destiny. That doesn't happen in democracy, as we've seen. But maybe there's something we're laboring towards that we'll never reach, but that can improve the human lot. And so that's about the extent that Michels is willing to give socialism and democracy its due. And so what does he say at the very end here? Well, here we are. This is very important. This kind of relates to the Saint Simonians earlier. The defects inherent in democracy are obvious. It is nonetheless true that as a form of social life, we must choose democracy as the least of evils. The ideal government would doubtless be that of an aristocracy of persons at once morally good and technically efficient. The Saint Simonian dream. But where shall we discover such an aristocracy? We may find it sometimes, though very rarely, as the outcome of deliberate selection, but we shall never find it where the hereditary principle remains in operation. Thus, monarchy in its pristine purity must be considered as imperfection incarnate, as the most incurable of ills. He says further down, it may be said, therefore, that the more humanity comes to recognize the advantages which democracy, however imperfect, presents over aristocracy, even at its best, the less likely it is that a recognition of the defects of democracy will provoke a return to aristocracy. And so the goal here is not a return to aristocracy or a return to monarchy. It is to Michels, I think, even in these final pages, having come face to face with the iron law of oligarchy, and having said socialism can never be achieved, that overthrowing the old order always produces a new order. You always produce a new bourgeois. There is no possibility. He says we can't go back. There has to be something in the future that we're struggling towards. There has to be something beyond this, and we can't embrace these romantic views of the past because those were even more imperfect. There has been improvement. But the ideal government of an aristocracy of persons morally good and technically efficient, which is all that seems to be permitted as a good ideal, where shall we find this? What is the system that'll bring it about? And you could argue basically every system has been aimed at trying to bring that about, and we haven't ever answered that question. So it's been fun, guys. I'm just going to close this out with reading the last paragraph of this book because it's been so long. We're already at an hour and 15 minutes. I'm not going to add any more commentary. I think we've come to the end, but maybe I'll do a follow-up video where I just talk about my thoughts or have somebody else on to talk about these ideas. But final considerations, page 371, the very last paragraph of the last chapter of the last part of political parties. The democratic currents of history resemble successive waves. They break ever on the same shoal. They are ever renewed. This enduring spectacle is simultaneously encouraging and depressing. When democracies have gained a certain stage of development, they undergo a gradual transformation, adopting the aristocratic spirit, and in many cases also the aristocratic forms, against which at the outset they struggled so fiercely. Now new accusers arise to denounce the traitors. After an era of glorious combats and of inglorious power, they end by fusing with the old dominant class. Whereupon once more they are in their turn attacked by fresh opponents who appeal to the name of democracy. It is probable that this cruel game will continue without end.